Good morning, friends. Today we are going to learn Introduction to Literary Criticism paper, the next part after the Introduction to Syllabus, that is Module 5th, Part 1st, Romantic Criticism. It is about the Romantic criticism and theory of poetic diction of Wordsworth. In the previous lecture, we learned about what is the syllabus of Introduction to Literary Criticism for your semester 6th. Now, we are going to learn Wordsworth theory of poetic diction. See, first of all, here is again I written the syllabus for your semester 6th, which we had already learned about it. See, Wordsworth, that is Wordsworth in 1798 with his publication of lyrical ballads, and Wordsworth as poet laureate. His life history. As we know, he was one of the milestone of romanticism, romantic criticism, and romantic poetry. So it is necessary to see in brief his life history. That born in 1770, 7th April at Cockermouth, Great Britain. Died in 23rd April 1850. His education was done in Cambridge University. He is related to the literary movement of Romanticism, that is from 1792 to 1850. Again, his important works, that is lyrical ballads and the excursion. First of all, we will see about lyrical ballads, that is his preface to lyrical ballads is called as the Manifesto of English Romantic Criticism and Literary Theory. Why it is called as the Manifesto of English Romantic Criticism? Because Wordsworth started a return of these lyrical ballads, and in this book Wordsworth showed the courage to enter the ground which no other poet has dared to tread. That is, the language of poetry was heavy, complex, complicated, and full of figures of speech and other poetic devices. But for the first time in the history of English literature, Wordsworth tried to write poetry in the language of common man, dealing with the themes related to common man's life and using the imagery and figures that they used or which common man faced in day-to-day life. That's why it is called as a Manifesto of English Romantic Criticism and Literary Theory. In 1793, he published an evening walk and descriptive sketches. In 1798, Wordsworth and Coleridge produced lyrical ballads, an important work in the Romantic movement. That how it is opposite to the French Revolution, neoclassical trends, and both of them produced this work as the response to the neoclassical literature, and it created one of the important movement of romantic criticism or romanticism. One of the Wordsworth's most famous poems, Tintern Abbey, was published in the work along with Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Both of these novels are important in the history of romantic literature. One of the famous definition of poetry, as all of us know it, which is the definition of poetry of Wordsworth. His definition of poetry in Preface to Lyrical Ballads, he presented or he discusses the elements of new poetry based on the real language of men. Real language of men means language of common people, the life of common people, which avoids the urban poetic diction of 18th century, that is, which is full of poetic devices and figures of speech and complicated sentences and complex. So it is different from the urban poetic diction. Here Wordsworth defines poetry as spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. So, according to Wordsworth, it is a spontaneous overflow of feelings which are powerful. That's why the poetry is real one and presents the real language. Why he needed a new theory? Wordsworth needed a new theory of poetry because poetry before him was urban. He wanted the language of commoners. He wanted to embrace the life of nature, and he wanted to present the nature in front of the people through his poetry, and that's why he became a sensitive poet in his presentation of nature. He felt poetry of the new age needed a new language, and he was required to defend his experiments. He protested against the pseudo-classical school, and that's why he needed a new theory of poetry. Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction. The particular part we are going to learn about it, that poetry before him was urban, so he needed to write down the new poetic diction or new theory of poetic diction. That is, the neoclassical poetic diction was mainly derived from the classical poets such as Virgil, Spenser, and Milton. These poets used to write poetry by using embellished language and particular decorum. Other prominent features of that period were the extensive use of difficult words, allusions, the personification of abstracts, and avoidance things considered as low or base. So, he want to change the theory of poetic diction, and he want to revise the theory as it is the theory of poetic diction which is for the common people. The poetry of that time was treated as something sacred. It was only the subject to the people with high intellect and of high status in the society. The poets in all ages have used a distinctive language, a poetic diction, which is not correct in ordinary discourse. He presents his views that the poetry of that time was treated as sacred, something sacred, and he want to change it. It should be for the all common people. What is poetic diction then? That the term diction refers to the kinds of words, phrases and sentence structures, and sometimes figurative language that constitute any work of literature. And this is the particular term for the poetic diction. And poetic diction refers to the style of writing used in poetry, the linguistic style, vocabulary, and use of figurative language, normally metaphors. So, the term diction, and after that, what is the poetic diction? It is related to the style of writing used in poetry. Four basic principles of Wordsworth theory of poetic diction. See what particular four basic principles Wordsworth presented in his theory of poetic diction. That is, it should have certain color of imagination. Again, should be the language really used by men but only selective words. Next, no difference between language of poetry and prose, and it should be the language of a vivid sensation. He want to show the color of imagination, use of the language of used by men, it means the common people, and should be the language of vivid sensation, means the emotions and feelings of the common people should be reflected in that particular poetry. Wordsworth's prime concern was to denounce such superficial and over-embellished language. Wordsworth's aim was to write poetry which symbolizes the life in its simple and rustic state. The poetry for Wordsworth must be like the part of daily life speech. See how Wordsworth presented his theory of poetic diction, and he wanted to present it as a language of common people, poetry of a common people, not for the urban people, or it should be for all ages and for all people. It should be written in such language that anyone who wants to read it could comprehend it easily. He wants to show that poetry is very much poetry should be very much familiar to the common people, or it should be understood by the common people. As in neoclassical poetry, they followed the classical literature, classical poetry, and again it is very much difficult to understand for the common people. And but Wordsworth here shows that poetry should be written in such language that anyone who wants to read it could comprehend it easily or understand easily. Wordsworth believes that all such ornamented poetry destroys the genuine and passionate feelings of the poet. So, ornamentation to the poetry, use of complex sentences, use of figurative language is destroys the emotions and feelings of the poet. So, he want to present it spontaneously as he written in his definition of poetry. He only justifies the use of an embellished language of poetry when it is naturally suggested by the feelings or the subject matter of the poetry. So, he want to justify the use of an embellished language of poetry when it is naturally suggested by the feelings or the subject matter of poetry. He want to suggest that it should be passionate feelings of the poets and real feelings of the poet, and he used that the poetry should be a language of real men. The poetry for Wordsworth is the expression of natural feelings, and these feelings cannot be communicated with the help of fake and version of upper class speech, but with the actual speech of humble and rustic life. He wants to present humble and rustic life in his poetry, and it shows the reflection of nature as well. He defines poetic diction as a language of common men. It is not the language of the poet as a class, but the language of mankind. Language of class, language of poet as a class means it should not be denote the particular class or denote the particular upper class people, but here he want to suggest language of poetry should be of all mankind. It is the simple expression of pure passions by men living close to nature. Again, he want to reflect the nature in his poetry through the common issues in the day-to-day life. The poetic language is the natural language, therefore it must be spontaneous and instinctive. The real poetic diction, in the view of the Wordsworth, is the natural overflow of the feelings, therefore it is immune to the deliberate decoration of the language. And Wordsworth also attributes the quality of giving pleasure to the natural poetic diction. It must not contain any vulgarity and disgusting element. The poet must, through his language, elevate the nature and human feelings. And again, he contradicted himself. All this presentation of poetic diction about the common man and nature, but he also contradicted himself that Wordsworth followed the main tenets of his theory in some of his poems, but it became difficult for him to stick strictly to his theory when he came to such splendid poems as Tinted Abbey and or Ode on the Intimations of Immortality, etc. This shows that though valuable, his theories could not completely encompass the scope of even his own poetry. So, Coleridge also differed from Wordsworth, that Wordsworth poetry should be the real language of men in a state of vivid sensation. According to Coleridge, a poem cannot be condemned only on the ground of different forms from the language of real life. Wordsworth said it should be the incident of common life, and Coleridge said nor can it be discarded for difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. Coleridge never wanted the language of prose and poetry should be same. He said the language of poetry is different and language of prose is different. According to Wordsworth, ideal language of poetry is the natural conversation of men under the influence of natural feeling. Here Wordsworth gives importance to the nature and the natural feelings, spontaneous feelings. Coleridge said that Wordsworth rules may be applicable only to certain classes of poetry and it need not be compulsory. Coleridge said that Wordsworth theory should not apply to all kinds of poetry and it is for the common man or common people. Coleridge's other objections. Coleridge objected Wordsworth that Coleridge denied Wordsworth's assertion that a special virtue lies in the language of those who are in close touch with nature. He argues that prose itself differs and ought to differ from the language of conversation, just like reading ought to differ from talking. So Coleridge denied Wordsworth's assertion that a special virtue lies in the language of those who are in close touch with nature. When anything becomes old and stale, always a new wave, a new revolt challenges the old and creates a new format. Then the new also becomes old, stratified, and wrinkled. So, Wordsworth's theory of poetic diction is also opposition to neoclassical, and his theory of poetic diction again become stale, and there is new wave after Wordsworth as well. Every generation feels impatient of its seniors. So did Wordsworth. So Wordsworth feel that it is it should be different language of poetry, different from neoclassical poetry or neoclassical poetic diction. The language used by the senior generations was not considered suitable to the demands and needs of the new age. So, according to the new age, according to the romantic literature, he wrote the poetry and his theory of poetic diction. Therefore, Wordsworth created his own language and advanced his theory in defense of his experiments and the language of his poetry. Here we can understand how Wordsworth theory is also not complete one, but he tried to present as per his new age and what is the demand of the common people and people from that society. What Wordsworth did, every generation tries to perceive the world in its own way. It creates new questions and finds out new answers for itself. So, every generation builds a new language and creates a new poetry to answer the questions of their times. This exactly is what Wordsworth did for his generation. And here we can understand this is the particular part of theory of poetic diction.